Hi.
Hello, we're back to the Pure Worship book. In the last segment, we looked at the overview that the Watchtower puts on page 14 of the book. And we've lamented before the fact that we still really haven't got to Ezekiel. But we had an overview last time. But now, on page 15, they go back to the beginning and start talking about Cain and Abel. And not briefly either. 5 whole pages on Cain and Abel, including a full color photograph taking up a whole, not photograph of Abel, that would be interesting, a picture of Abel that takes up a whole page. Why so much time on Cain and Abel? So what we're going to do is switch over to we have to read this from screen because we have no hard copy of the book, so excuse us if we look distracted, and we'll do that right now. We'll move over. All right, this is entitled, this chapter 2 is entitled God approved their gifts, and it's based on Hebrews 11:4. But before we go to the text, here's the subhead. And it says the focus of this chapter is on a history of Jehovah's arrangement for pure worship. So that sets the mind in a certain direction. Arrangement, organization. We're already thinking about us versus them. The organization that's pure worship and something else, an arrangement apparently, or an improvisation that is not pure worship. And of course that sets up the whole book then to be a us versus them, doesn't it? So let's read the text they base it all on, which is Hebrews 11 verse 4.
By faith, I'm reading from the Silver Sword. By faith, Abel offered God a sacrifice of greater worth than that of Cain. And through that faith he received the witness that he was righteous, for God approved his gifts, and although he died, he still speaks through his faith. You were going to read from the ESV?
Yeah, here's the ESV. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks.
So it's what we note is that it's comparative. It's not saying yes or no. It's just saying one was better than the other.
Mine says a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. Yours says again?
Of greater worth than that of Cain.
So we're talking about the relative worth or acceptability of two kinds of sacrifice, or two persons sacrificing, but we're not making a black and white in here, because the way God treats Cain indicates that we don't do what God did himself in Genesis chapter 4 in differentiating between these two. The thing that's focused on in Genesis is not exactly what you're doing with it here.
I think too, with that subtitle, thinking of that, a history of Jehovah's arrangement, when you go back and look at the text in Genesis, you don't hear God commanding. Like, yes, God gave the example and sacrifice, but you don't hear any commands or instructions. He doesn't make an arrangement. He doesn't say, now this is the way you are. At least we're not given that information.
We're not told that. So how did they get this idea about sacrifice?
They might have gotten it simply from the example that they heard of, that God clothed Adam and Eve. He offered a sacrifice. That's the only clue you have, but it's not a command or an instruction.
That's right. It's not a revelation yet. So we don't have to read the whole 5 pages. A lot of it is just speculative. But we want to zero in on a couple of points that they make, and especially in paragraphs 2 and 3 here. I'll read it for you. The Apostle Paul was inspired to write regarding Abel, God approved his gifts. Jehovah, however, rejected Cain's offering. This raises questions that we need to consider. Why did God accept worship from Abel, but not from Cain? What can we learn from the examples of Cain and Abel, and from others mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11? The answers will deepen our understanding of what is involved in pure worship. They've already moved from acceptable to pure.
And approved, acceptable and pure now.
One is approved and one is not.
Yeah, there's
at
no
all.
comparative here.
And then paragraph 3 says, as we discuss this brief overview of events from the time of Abel to Ezekiel's day, note 4 key elements that in combination make worship acceptable to God. The recipient must be Jehovah. The quality must be the best. The manner has to be approved by God. And the motive of the worshiper needs to be pure. I have to shake my head because, well, first of all, the recipient. Now, of course, the recipient must be Jehovah, but what's the problem when you go to the New Testament, as they do here in Hebrews?
Yeah, once you get to the New Testament, you have the preaching about Jesus. You know, people are confessing faith in Jesus. Even when he's there are acts of worship towards him that he doesn't reject. So you do have a problem here. It's not going to fit the narrative of the Watchtower.
No, the name above every name. So the mere statistic, which is that in the Greek text of the New Testament, we have approximately 900 uses of the name Jesus, 0 of the Tetragrammaton. So how is the recipient Jehovah?
Yeah. So of course in their New World Translation they insert the name, but still you've got the greater amount being to Jesus. Jesus is praised. Jesus is worshipped.
Preached.
Jesus is preached. And the name by which you're saved is Jesus.
And that goes to, like you just said, the statistic. Even if you go with their statistic, which is 900 approximately uses of Jesus and 237 insertions of Jehovah, you've still got the same problem. The center of attention, and therefore of worship in the New Testament, is Christ Jesus himself. And there's another fact involved in that. You yourself say, if you're in the Watchtower world, that the principal way we worship Jehovah is to preach his name publicly.
Which they didn't do.
Yeah. Then they say the quality must be the best. Well, that's pretty hard to judge.
I think the thing with the preaching, though, that means all the disciples and apostles were not pure worshipers of Jehovah.
Absolutely.
That cuts everyone off after when even, it's before even Jesus came.
So you're the only people who qualify. You, Jehovah's Witnesses, since Rutherford invented the name Jehovah's Witnesses, you are the only pure worshipers that have existed since the 1st century, apparently. And that doesn't count the apostles and their co-workers. The quality must be the best. The manner has to be approved by God, and the motive of the worshiper. This really worries me. The motive of the worshiper needs to be pure. Well, who can gauge what the motive of a worshiper is?
Yeah. Can you read people's motives? I mean, I know they try to read people. We had people questioning our motives as soon as we left. You can't sincerely object to anything.
No, your motive has to be not good. And they'll judge you for that. So it's not a surprise that they spend the next, paragraphs 4 to 9 speculating on why was Cain's worship rejected. A lot of it is okay or acceptable in terms of their reasoning. For instance, they reason that it can't be about the vegetation being offered as opposed to the blood.
Yeah, because they look at the law.
They look at the law and they say, well, God accepted that. That was acceptable sacrifice. Not in substitution for blood, that's true. But that's a correct point. And they've at the end of paragraph 5, they say, and Jehovah talked with Cain after he offered his sacrifice. Well, that's kind of an admission that there was something of a relationship between Cain and God, even after he murdered his brother, not just after he offered an, you say, unacceptable sacrifice, but
he
after
still
he
has a
murdered his
relationship.
brother.
I mean, you're talking about Adam and Eve still having a relationship with God too.
Yeah.
And they have sinned and been driven out of the garden, and yet God is still communicating with them.
Yeah, and then I think the reason that this disturbs me, the part I felt was most disturbing here is in paragraph 8. When they get to this, Cain's bad heart made any other positive aspects of his worship worthless. There's no comparative here. Worthless.
No. Yeah.
His example teaches us that pure worship requires more than just an outward display of devotion to Jehovah. So if you're a witness, what are you going to think?
You're going to just always doubt yourself. There's no certainty here. Do I have a bad heart? You know, like that's always going to be in the back of your head. And if you're honest about yourself, you're not deluded about yourself, that you're not pure, you're always going to feel uncertain and question whether or not God loves you.
Yeah. I can't see that this can be, there's any peace with God or any peace of God. And Paul does make both points, right? In Romans 5 and in Philippians chapter 4, he makes the point that you can have peace with God and still not have the peace of God. I don't think you can have even peace with God with this arrangement.
No. This is heartbreaking stuff.
And then it gets worse. But the last paragraph of this segment on Cain anyway, and Abel is paragraph 13. After the page picture of Abel, you have this. Abel's example teaches us that pure worship can come only from a heart that has pure motives, a heart full of faith in Jehovah and in complete agreement with his righteous standards. In addition, we learn that pure worship requires more than a single act of devotion. It involves our whole life, our entire course of conduct.
Yeah, so any witness reading this is going to feel hopeless. He's going to feel so unsure of himself.
He won't have any peace.
No, yeah. You
can't have any peace.
Yeah, you're going to be questioning yourself right to the day of your death.
Because what does it mean to have complete agreement, to be in complete agreement with his righteous standards? So either you're going to be despondent or you're going to be self-righteous like a Pharisee.
Yeah, a heart full of faith. You know, what about the accounts where the man says, "Help my faith"? I guess he's out. This is very sad.
So you can either end up deluded like the Pharisees in the New Testament, thinking that you're looking down on your fellow Jews even because they're not up to your righteous standards that you think you are meeting, or you're going to be despondent. And I think that's the way it works out with most witnesses today, from what I can tell. There's the whole aspect then of why are we spending 5 pages on this story when they're jumping around here in the text between really only a handful of texts that you have.
Yeah.
This is an interesting fact that the Cain and Abel story is never referenced again in the Old Testament. So obviously the Jews in the Old Testament didn't make a lot of this story like you're making here. And then Cain is referenced 3 times in the New Testament and Abel 4 times. But 3 of the 4 Abel references are to his martyrdom. And that's a point I think we should think about, that who is being martyred for the Christian gospel in our modern age now.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for you, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, most of the martyrs are not you. They're Christians who are dying for the name of Christ.
And you already would have cast them off.
Yeah.
Even though they're being martyred.
Yeah. They are in the camp of Cain to you, not offering acceptable worship to Jehovah.
So, you know, I think it's very sad because you're either going to be a Pharisee who were condemned as having this superiority, thinking we're doing it purely, but those fellow people who are also going to the temple,
God's organization,
worshiping God with us, they're not pure, so they're out. So you're really self-deluded if you think you're pure. And, you know, that account of Luke 18 where the 2 go up, the tax collector and the Pharisee, he's condemned in that account because he really does think he's deluded about himself. But the poor tax collector who's going up and worshiping with him, he views him as a cast-off. So how depressing and how sad one was made to feel by the Pharisees if they were just common Jewish people. and how diluted. So either way, you're in a bad place if it fit those molds.
We've just used the statistics about the number of references to Cain and Abel, 3 and 4, in the New Testament, not at all in the Old Testament after Genesis chapter 4. And there's a statistic about the number of Pharisees that we could reference too. I didn't know there were only about 6,000 Pharisees. So you got 6,000 Pharisees who think of themselves as the pure worshippers, and then they're worshiping, however, with 6 million other Jews who are not Pharisees, who they look down upon.
Yeah.
So you can see that there's a perfect parallel, really, with the first century, in that, like you just said, that there's only two options if you think of pure worship as being the only kind of worship that God accepts.
Yeah. There's no grace.
It's graceless. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And our link is?
We're going to link to a video we did on Cain in chapter 4 of Genesis. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In which we make the case, I think, that Cain didn't get disfellowship for being, in your view, an impure worshiper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
See you soon.
Bye. So, you happy with it?